Hey, Dad, are you ready for dinner table prep?
I'm all ready this afternoon.
Good, me too. Um, so we're going to try today to talk about the 2024 presidential election.
We're getting right to the middle of this thing to start with. Good.
It's a big topic, and we assume that it's something that you might want to be talking with folks about, whether that's family, friends, community. And so we want to use our framework and talk about some ways you can use the framework to have those conversations productively.
Yep. Just real quick on the framework, there's 5 different ways, 5 different spokes on the framework, and let's just mention those because we're going to be talking about them as we go along.
Yep.
Objectives, parameters,
Yep.
obstructions and gateways, sources, and assumptions. Um,
Perfect.
and, and those are the things that that's the framework as we look at it, and you can jump from one to the other. There isn't any particular way to follow through, but that's the way we look at having conversations, and that's a part of what we've been doing here since we started.
Yes. And so I think with this particular topic, the 2024 election, which depending on the group of people you're with can be pretty divisive. I wanted to start specifically with gateways. And gateways are the things that further that conversation along. And Dad, I know as we've been talking about this, a couple of the things that we've really been thinking about as gateways are the way that you yourself are during a conversation and the questions that you can ask somebody related to a topic.
There are impediments to having conversations, and that's the part that gives us anxiety. And some people are anxious and don't want to engage in conversations right now
Some
about,
people are anxious and do want to engage.
and they do. And you might be one or the other, and it's helpful to understand where everybody is as you engage in your dinner and in your conversation around that dinner.
Yeah. And so, specifically with the 2024 election, I think there are also a few obstructions that can get in the way of a productive conversation. I just want to call a couple of those out before we jump too far in, Dad, because I think we're going to run into those. And I think one of the things that happens in a two-party system like we have in the US is that you end up ultimately with two candidates. And for most people, there is some or a lot of compromise that goes into choosing the candidate they ultimately end up voting for. But I think in the conversation that we have, we often make the assumption that there is not compromise. And so we assume a lot about what a person thinks or feels based on the candidate that they ultimately end up voting for. So when we have these conversations with folks, if they state who they're voting for, rather than making that assumption, one of the things that we wanted to start calling out here are the types of questions that you can ask to really understand where someone is coming from. Because when we're talking about dinner table conversation, we want that to be pleasant. We want that to be productive. We want that to be something that's enjoyable for folks. And a lot of times these questions can really help us get to know someone else.
Yeah, and I think again, just a little back up on that. Um, Systems like we have, processes that we have, end up giving us choices. We have to make choices. Candidate A, candidate B, vote yes, vote no, whatever the case is. And everybody may have some problems with how they got where they got, but this is the decision you have today. So you might be for Biden, you might be for Trump, but you might be for them for different reasons than somebody else is for them. Maybe the reason you support Donald Trump is because he's effective at the policy side. Maybe the reason you're with him is because of a specific issue. Same thing goes for Biden. You might be with him because of something that he's done. You might be with him because of the whole ideology behind his party.
You
There's
might be
all
for
different
neither
reasons.
of those people.
And you may not be. Exactly. And you might just say, hey, nobody speaks for me. Here's where I am, and here's where
Yep.
I wish this was. Those are good things to ask somebody about, though.
Yes.
If they are supporting one candidate versus another, you might ask them, if is that the perfect candidate for you, or would you have
Yes.
preferred something else? You might ask them to identify either somebody else or some other characteristic of a candidate that would have been preferential to you if this
Yes.
is what we end up with. Those are good things to ask
I
just to
really
get
like
an
that question you
idea.
had earlier, Dad. You said if your ideal candidate or if your current candidate couldn't run, the one that you're supporting,
Yeah.
who would you support next? Who would be your next choice and why? Like that's a really good way to get somebody to kind of again It takes the divisiveness out of the current conversation, and it really gets to the heart of why somebody is supporting or what they're looking to support in a candidate.
Ask yourself the same question. I mean,
Yeah.
if my candidate that I'm leaning toward or supporting wholeheartedly wasn't there, who would I want next in line? I mean, where to go? Those are good questions that help you and help everybody else get a better understanding of what's up. You know, what our issues are with each other, perhaps if we don't agree. So those are good questions to ask, and I think that's a part of a dialogue that also demonstrates that you're listening. If you're
Yeah.
asking somebody a question instead of telling them something, you're more than likely going to hear what they say because you asked the question.
Yeah.
And that dialogue, that two-way exchange is a lot healthier, we think, in a conversation than having one party saying this and one party saying that. And that are kind of maybe sometimes irreconcilable. So if you say I'm for this person because of this reason, but if the world was perfect, I might be for this person, or those candidates, those are good things to introduce into that conversation. I think that's helpful. And Jamie, for you and me, I think that's how we talk about things a lot. That's why we are able to disagree sometimes on topics, but be able to both of us come out at the end thinking that it was a positive experience having had the conversation. And I hope that people can sit down at the dinner table and have people who are for Joe Biden, for RFK Jr., for Donald Trump, for whomever the list of candidates.
So you're leaving out a whole bunch of folks there.
Oh, as I said, that whole list of candidates that's running this year. But if people can say more about what causes them to support those people, I think that is helpful to the dialogue. And I think
I think it also, Dad, helps with the parameters, right? Because sometimes when somebody is talking about a candidate, what they really are talking about is party politics. Yeah. And sometimes they're not. They are talking about a specific issue or a specific characteristic of that person that they like. And by identifying what that driving force is, you're better able to engage. And I think also check our own assumptions, right? It doesn't, if they're talking party ideology over a specific characteristic, that really helps us to understand where that person's coming from, especially in years where we have presidential elections coming up. And maybe all the time, really, to be honest. Yeah. Well, we find that our sources, again, because of the two-party system, because of the way our media systems work, the sources in and of themselves are divisive. And so if what we're bringing to the conversation is only headlines that we pull from sources, which isn't bad, I'm not judging that. But what I mean by that is if you're only bringing these very divisive headliney kinds of thoughts to a conversation, inevitably the conversation itself is going to be divisive. And so again, thinking about questions that we can do to bring it back from the black and white, this person versus this person, and really be thinking about the underlying cause for those thoughts, helps us move the conversation forward productively.
Well, the platforms are different, and on different platforms, you use you demonstrate your issues in different ways. And Jamie, you had that example. Go ahead and give it, because I think it's important.
Yeah. We were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. So I love to watch debates, and I've been following along with the Republican debates, which admittedly have not been as exciting as I was hoping they were going to be. But there was a candidate that I thought was kind of intriguing in one of them, and I went to follow up on their website to learn more about them. It was someone I didn't know a lot about. And I found it so, I think incongruous is the only word I can think of to describe it. The presence that they had in the debate and the website were so different from one another that I almost felt like they were different candidates. And Dad, you had such a good point about this, which is like, candidates have a job. Their job is to get elected. To get elected, they need money, and they know how to raise money. So they're going to present in different ways. So if you're only watching the debate and I'm only reading the website, we're going to have really different perspectives on individual people. And that's true in general. If you're reading this source of news about your presidential candidate and I'm reading this source about a different presidential candidate, we need to find a way to bridge our sources so that we can have a productive conversation.
Yeah. And I just think, honestly, there's a lesson to be learned a little bit there. And that's that their platforms, on different platforms, you might hear different things from the same candidate because they have different audiences. Same thing for us. When we're having dinner with our family, neighbors, and friends, or whatever it might be, it's good to understand that platform versus having a debate platform someplace else. I mean,
Yes.
you might want to temper what you're saying or adjust what you're saying to your audience, and there's nothing wrong with that. When that candidate goes out there and the website platform is what they're using, they are working in the realm of clicks. They're trying to get people to click and donate. That's a different world than being on a debate format with other candidates where it's a whole different presentation. So I understand the kind of the frustration of looking at that, but there's a reality to it that maybe is something we can also learn from ourselves in how we have our conversations with others. Temper the conversation to the audience that you have as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot. It's similar to sort of like, the version of your life on Instagram and the version of your life in real life.
Yes,
Maybe
that'd be a
maybe
good
that
one.
dates me as my platform of choice, but I think that's true. And the other piece related to this and sources that I think is important with the presidential election is when we're talking to folks about how they're making their choices about a candidate. One of the things I like to ask is that specific question. When you're coming up with a candidate, how do you decide who you're going to support? And I think there are so many ways that people figure this out. And it's important for us to know because when we're trying to engage productively with someone, um, Dad, we were talking about this earlier. We had a conversation about a candidate, and you were supportive of that particular candidate's policy, and I was not supportive of that person as a person and their behavior. And so our conversation didn't have a good way to connect and be productive, which we eventually recognized and said, like, okay, we're talking about this differently. Like, I'm not talking about policy, and I'm not talking about this person's behavior. Um, and so when we're thinking about that, asking folks like, are you somebody who looks at vote records? Are you watching debates? Are you really following like a party ideology or a religion or a culture? Or is there a particular issue that you feel really passionate about and that's how you're a single issue voter this year?
And there's nothing wrong with any of those.
No.
Those are all important things, and they are drivers for different people. There are many people who support a candidate for a specific issue because of a
Yep.
specific issue. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's helpful to understand that when you're having
Yes.
conversation with them, because I might be thinking that you're supporting that candidate for a whole range of issues or something, and you might say, no, for me, this is the most important part of this. And that's
Yep.
helpful to understand, because then
Yes.
I can look at it and say, oh, I understand how that person looks at that issue, and that when I'm having a discussion with them, these things are seemingly irrelevant because of that. The other thing to look at to me, and if you're dealing with family that you know very well, they may know where you come from, kind of where your issue base might be, or all those they support. I think something helpful to also use other sources to help somebody who maybe doesn't come from the same place, doesn't argue the same, doesn't see the
Yep.
same sources that I, doesn't monitor the same sources that I do. And so just like a couple days ago, I told Jamie, I said, I saw a New York Times poll, and here's what the New York Times poll said. Part of telling her that it was a New York Times poll was to lend more, I would say, credibility to what I was making as a case. If I had used another source for that same information
Yep.
that would be expected, that might give it maybe less credible. So it's something to think about, is where you get your information and how you share with others, what your sources are. Your source for your position may be your religion. And
Yep.
that's a good thing for other people to understand. I mean, if that's the reason you have that position, you're probably well entrenched in that, and that's probably something that you're not going to be very likely to be flexible about for one reason or another. But
Yep.
those are good things for everybody to kind of get a better understanding about what this discussion is about and why. Why are other people saying these things? Why do I say what I'm saying? Those sources are a part of that, and it's something I think is helpful to ask somebody when they tell you something that sounds like a fact. Just ask, hey, where did you get that? Because that's not what I've heard. I'm interested in knowing why you think this about that specific fact, and that's a good thing to ask. I'm not saying that you're challenging them on their facts. I'm just saying ask them where they get it, because it might not be reconcilable with whatever your fact set might be, and that's okay. It's just good to understand.
Yeah, Dad, I think it also brings up the point that I find tricky right now is I know and in this current, when we're talking about the election, I think this is actually true for a lot of folks. They might only know sort of the two big names because they don't know who else is out there. They're not following along with debates.
Right.
They're not following sort of the smaller folks in the election. And so they feel like they don't know enough to even engage in the conversation, because I think so often we expect ourselves to know everything before we engage in the conversation. And I think what you and I are talking about all the time is, how do we learn together through these conversations so that you can go in there and say, like, actually, I only know these two candidates. Like, who else should I be looking at? Is there someone else
Yes.
interesting that might, or whatever that is, or I've really been following this one issue. Are there other issues that you find interesting that I should look at?
Yeah.
And being authentic there.
I don't know if we talked about this yet in this version, Jamie, but objectives are really important to understand. What's the reason for having this conversation in the first place? Am I trying to convince somebody else of something, to persuade them to change their position?
Their vote? Yeah. Do you want them to vote with you?
Am I just trying to say, hey, I'd like to know more about who you support and why? Is it, what is the point of it? Because that objective in a conversation is important, because I might be arguing for my candidate with you, trying to convince you that my candidate is better than whoever I think you're supporting. And you might not be supporting anybody, and you might be trying to find out more information about candidates or whatever the case might be. And those objectives, if they don't line up, might make for a less comfortable conversation, because you're not heading in the same direction at all. You're not engaging for the same reasons, and that can make for a conversation that doesn't work very well. So it might be helpful to say, hey, I'm interested in knowing what you think, because I want to just know how somebody gets where you got. I mean, I just don't understand that. And there's nothing wrong. Ask those questions, because that's what it's all about.
Totally. And I think the sort of last piece that we can mention here is something, Dad, that I like that you were talking about too, again, with objectives. We all know that person who's going to show up to the dinner and they're going to say something just to say it, right? And some people they have an objective. It might not be one that I relate to, but they certainly have an objective. And I think one of the objectives that we have, if we're trying to have dinner table conversation, is that we want to leave feeling good about the conversation. We want other people to leave feeling good about the conversation. And we hope that it's something we could do again. And so I think just by giving ourselves this model to think about when we're having these conversations, when somebody says something really inflammatory, having something in your pocket, the question to ask to sort of diffuse the situation a little bit, like, oh, that is certainly a viewpoint, tell me a little bit about how you got to that, or whatever that might be. And maybe the calculus that you do on this says, actually don't engage. It would be better to just not engage. But having that in your head as a way to prepare for these kinds of conversations, I think is great. And especially with something like this upcoming election, which is still quite a ways off. So we've got some time to be talking about this. I think we want to make sure that it's the kind of thing that we can keep doing over and over and build on those conversations as a strong foundation.
Right. And I think, like you said, you're going to end up with people who think different ways. You're going to have some times where the temperature gets turned up a little bit in these conversations. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of how we have our conversations anyway. But expect that. I think what you want to be able to do is on the fly kind of keep monitoring the situation. Don't get caught up in the heat so much, and try to find out what's causing the heat and ask some questions about that. If somebody's temper gets out of hand, ask some questions. Just say, hey, obviously not everybody agrees on this. That's why we're having this conversation where we are. I'd like to better understand why you think this, and find out what the basis for those things are. I mean, ask questions. I think it's helpful in the dialogue, and you might learn something in the process. I mean, I think it's a good thing.
That's the goal, right? To learn about each other, to have to be a productive and engaging conversation.
Yeah, well, we don't want the debate to be the cause of your indigestion. Let it be the meal you're eating instead.
Yeah, I like that. All right. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. We would love if you would reach out to us. Let us know if you're having any conversations about the upcoming election, things that have gone well, questions you have. We had some people who submitted questions before this actual conversation. So thank you. Thank you for listening. We'd love to hear how this is going. So you can reach us at ourhouseundivided@gmail.com. And you can also reach us on Instagram. We're at House Undivided. We have a green, or I'm sorry, not green. Oh my gosh, red and blue house icon. There's a lot of houses undivided, evidently. So, all right, Dad, thanks. Love
Hey,
you.
no, thank you. Love you. Have a great day.
All right.